Sometimes it's what you know, other times it's who you know. This time was a little bit of both. Welcome back, Troglodytes, to your daily dose of guitar information, the Trogly's Guitar Show. Before we get too deep into that story, let's go ahead and check out what we've got here first. That is a gorgeous Les Paul. I'm excited for today's episode. So I recently became a friend of somebody who runs a large guitar store, and they had a few interesting Les Pauls show up in their shop, and he sent me a couple of photos, and he's like, hey, can you help us identify these? In particular, this one, because they thought it might be a 1990 Gibson Les Paul Classic, one of the plus top ones. However, I was able to quickly correct them that no, this is a 1990 Prehistoric. So again, this is before the custom shop starts making these, so it's still a Gibson USA product. However, in 1983, they introduced the Les Paul reissue. We talked all about that in this episode right here. However, Prehistorics can be hard to identify once the Les Paul Classic enters the mix in late 1989. So how do you tell the difference between a prehistoric and a classic? That's the question we're going to answer today. Because even back then, some unscrupulous dealers would change a few small parts out on classics and sell them as the higher end reissue. The number one thing to distinguish the two different models is what pickup it came with. Because the early classics come with ceramic uncovered pickups, the 496R 500T set. However, it's very easy to add pickup covers to them or change them out. So if you don't have access to cavity shots, it can be tricky. Whereas the Les Paul reissue, it will come stock with a covered pickup. And depending on what year your prehistoric is, it can range from a few things. Another thing you could look for is the 1960 on the pickguard. Most prehistorics will have it. This one's kind of a survivor in that aspect. However, again, it's really easy to swap that out. Same thing is true for your Les Paul Classic truss rod cover that the prehistorics will not have. Take a look at your logo. This is the prehistoric styling. It kind of falls in on itself. Whereas the early classics have something similar, but yet ever so slightly different. It's a rather thinner font, I guess you could say. And it's hard to say things 100% sure because you gotta remember this is all transitional stuff. And you might just say, hey Trogly, look at the top. One's a plain top, the other one's crazy. Gotta remember, there's some insane flame plus top classics out there. I just don't happen to have one for this episode. Another thing to consider is the inlay material. The reissues have the standard acrylic looking stuff, nothing too fancy. Whereas the early classics have a slightly different material that's nearly mirror-like. Now, every single one's going to be a little bit different, but that's something else you could help use to identify it from the outside. But up until about 1992, the prehistoric reissues will actually have the washer screwed on bushings, whereas the classic has the vintage style push-in bushings, which is actually a more historically correct part for a Les Paul reissue. But both of them will have the ABR1 bridge with the thumb bleeders around their knobs, but you can also see the knob styling's a little bit different. But when it comes to their serial numbers, they are both ink stamped, although the classic's font is just a little bit larger. But again, that varies year to year. It's hard to make a blanket statement, as this is a pretty early 1990. Most of them will have the 4 digits. But you could also consider things like backplate covers. These ones are brown. These ones are black. Again, a very easy part to replace. Another thing you could look for would be like the top carve styling. Sometimes you just have to appreciate that stuff in person. It's too hard to photograph. The classics are decent, don't get me wrong, but that reissue has a little bit better of a dish. But this is what the model lineup looked like in 1990. You had the standard, classic, and the Les Paul reissue. All are very nice guitars, but there's a reason why the classics have that cult following. It's because they offered so much for a great value. And to most people, paying twice as much for the formal reissue just isn't worth it, especially if you can find a plus top one. But here's a fun comparison of their headstock styles. You can see the prehistoric is just like a little bit wider, whereas the early classics had a very eclectic look to it. But around 1993, since confusion kept happening between these two, Gibson downgrades the classic from Les Paul model silkscreen to just say Les Paul Classic. That way no more shenanigans could happen. So I hope you find that kind of helpful. It's a bit confusing. I do have private help sessions on my website if you need help identifying your guitar, but those are some visual cues from the outside that you can look for. But ultimately, what you really want to be able to do is get inside your pickup cavities. Again, it varies year to year, but they will actually have it stamped in here, Les Paul reissue, versus just having a color code and a date. However, this one's still early enough that it does not have that yet. So again, it's confusing. You have to look at all the clues and make a judgment based from that. But to learn more about this one, let's go ahead and throw it on the workbench to take an individual look at its parts and specs before we get to a short tone sample. This one must have been stored like the past 25 years. It's looking so much better now that I've got it polished up. But this one's actually extra fun. We get to learn about Gibson's pickup history. There was a short-lived variation that looked like this. It says Gibson USA, the original, HBR for rhythm, and then HBL for the lead. They're Alnico 5 circuit board pickups, which are unlike anything Gibson ever tried or tried again, you know, outside of your whole coil splitting PCB stuff. So generally speaking, you will find these in 1988 and 1989. However, there is the caveat that they actually came out in late 87 and lasted until very early 1990. So this is the ultra tail end of actually being able to find these in here. So that is a big difference between a late 87 through early 1990 Gibson Prehistoric as compared to the other years. But something cool to know about these is they are actually 4-conductor wiring. They didn't come stock with push-pull pots or anything like that, but you could wire it up that way if you wanted to. As far as the readings, the bridge is 9.05 k ohms. The neck is 7.36, the middle position 4.06. It's also important to know that there's 2 different versions out there. They're not marked differently, but some will read in the 14 to 15 k ohm range, so there are slightly wound hotter versions out there. And then other ones that are like this that are a bit more traditional. But now let's look inside our pickup cavities. It's not 1993 yet, so we don't have a long neck tenon. However, we do have a color stamp. HDSB, Heritage Dark Sunburst. The 1983 Prehistoric that we recently reviewed had that exact same stamping, but it looked like this. But by 1990, it starts to look like that. I do like the look of the 90s Prehistorics and the early Historics. They just have a very interesting look to them. Like they're slightly faded, but not that much. There's a little bit of artistry to them. And for whatever reason, it's very common to be able to feel the 3D nature of your top. So normally your clear coat is completely even, but these, you can actually feel the ridges of the flame. You can kind of see that even as you run the light along it. As far as our bridge pickup cavity, it reads April 6 of 1990. But it's not long after this that they swap it into saying just straight up reissue. The classics just continued to get the date stamp, and then the Les Paul standards will sometimes be LPS. But some people still got taken because not everybody takes out the pickups to verify their guitars when they buy them. Not that there's anything wrong with a classic, by the way. I just bring that up because it's a really funny period of time where there were 2 similar models out there that cost vastly different prices when offered brand new. But you can see the raw look of our maple top. But look how dark the mahogany is. You gotta remember, 90s is when they were rebirthing the entire company. They were trying to use better woods. It was the start of something really good. So delicious, you've got some pancake syrup running down the side. Nah, that's just glue for the top. So in this case, besides what I've already told you, how do we know it's a prehistoric? It's because it's got the Bill Lawrence, the original pickups. If it was a classic, it'd be the 496R 500T. Again, for this particular year. But now let's check out our bridge and tailpiece. Just like the classic, it has a traditional post-mounted ABR1. You do not have a bushing within the body. That's one of the largest differences between a regular standard of the era. And the ABR1 looks like so. It's got the wire retainer to it and has that branding on the back. The tailpiece is still full weight with a casting mark like this. Now you might have noticed this looks a little bit different than how we first unboxed it. I added a spare poker chip I had around here. But besides a couple of nicks and dings on the top, this whole flame top just came to life. It's actually in pretty decent shape up here. I only saw like some minor gouges and marks over here. I initially purchased this one thinking, yeah, I'm gonna add this to my prehistoric collection. However, there's one thing that's making me think, do I offer it for sale or not? But we'll get to that later. But when you polish a guitar, you really get to feel that top carve. It's ridiculously flat right here. Like it just goes scooped down and then it goes up. Like it's a little bit obnoxious, like maybe a bit too exaggerated in that area. It's just funny to see what they were trying at that time. Every single one will be a little bit different. But we can move on from our mahogany body, 2-piece maple top. We've got that mahogany neck with a rosewood fretboard. These frets were literal sandpaper trying to do bends, so I did my best in polishing those up. But honestly, I think it could use a second polishing to get them back to where they probably should be. I noticed the crown's like completely lost on this particular fret, so I think somebody did some minor leveling. So we'll have to see if that sets up okay as is, or if it might need a recrown job. There's definitely a lot of life left to these frets though. But the nut measure is 1.69 inches, which increases to 2.07 by the 12. It's a very thin neck at 0.84 for first fret neck depth, and 0.95 by the 12th. So it's not like Les Paul Reissue has bigger neck than Les Paul Classic. Honestly, they're not all that different. I mean, maybe this one's a little bit more rounded, but not by much. Here's a look at that neck profile on the first fret and the 12th fret. I would still categorize this as a 60s neck. It's nice and rounded, but trust me, that is a slim neck. But now our headstock. What's different this time? Well, you can see by 1990, they fixed the weird outline that occurred around the early prehistorics. So it looks a little bit better in that aspect. This one has a really high Les Paul model silkscreen, which is a semi-wet era correct thing. Still have just our regular truss rod cover though. This one's got a chip up here. I'd replace it with a historic one, but I didn't want to confuse guys watching this one in the future thinking that that was stock. This is one of those truss rods that's like never been used, so you don't have any loosening direction, but you've got all the tightening direction, which is typically what you need. So I've got it strung back up now, thinking that, oh, the frets just need a polish, but now that I'm looking at it, it appears somebody leveled the frets and then just never did the crowning and polishing to make the frets nice and smooth again. So yeah, it's definitely a little bit scratchy. I'm curious how it will sound through an amp though. Moving on to the backside, this cleaned up okay. It's got a lot of scratching back here, just surface level stuff. You could refinish the back of the guitar if you really wanted to and likely get rid of all of it. But the thing that kind of bugs me condition wise is actually down here. Someone was careless and just like banged this into something, and there's actually a physical impression into the wood. It's either that or it could have been a strap that had like a metal something that just wore away the wood. But then again, there's another giant ding right here. But anyways, here's what the inside control cavity looks like. They are using shielding paint in this era. The wiring, to be honest, it looks a little bit messy, but hey, it's 4-conductor wiring. So they've got all this other stuff going on top of your toggle switch. So again, if you wanted to put push-pull pots in here, those pickups are 100% able to be coil split. And these 3 pots date to late 1989. This one is a different style and lower. It's possible that's been replaced because that solder work does not look original to me, but I cannot read what date that one might be. But here we can see a square channel cavity route. We've got a plastic output jack plate. I restored this to original Gibson strap buttons. Came to me with these giant Stratocaster ones. So these are modern day replacements, but look good. And here's our toggle switch cavity. The thin binding in the cutaway is present, so you can see that maple top peeking through right there by the binding. Other than that, rather uneventful as far as the sides. Now running up the back side of the neck, you've got some scratches, some light impressions. But thankfully, no breaks, cracks, or repairs, and it cleaned up and polished up nicely. Something to know about these Gibson branded tuners, they don't tend to last long if you don't lubricate them. And if you lubricate them, make sure you take them off the guitar or use a dry lubricant, otherwise you're going to discolor your finish. A couple of these feel like they might be close to breaking. Once they start to skip gears, eventually it's just going to pop the entire back off and then it just never goes back together. But no made in USA stamp, but kind of an interesting serial number. I could see how this would confuse someone. 000 looks like 68. So this is a very early 1990 prehistoric reissue, but it has the interesting layout of a 1960. But with older guitars, it's very important to do a blacklight test just to make sure there's nothing hiding. But it's also important to know that just because something blacklights 100% evenly doesn't mean it's the original finish. It just means it was all applied at the same time. We are just looking for areas of finish where we might not have noticed or touched up spots. Everything else, that just comes down to how many of these have you seen, felt, and smelt to know if it's the original. But like if you missed this ding, you can see that because it broke the finish, or that one down there. Now flipping over to the top, this one passes the test in my eyes. I am suspicious that somebody might have replaced the knobs. I'd have to do a little bit more deep dive into that, because these actually have a certain glow to them, which kind of reminds me more so of the modern day historic ones. They tend to glow like that. I'll have to do some more digging into that. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, somebody took the poker chip off and those knobs just came off real easily. I had to adjust that. But our neck's good and our headstock is good. But all said and done, this one is 9 pounds, 7.1 ounces. So not the heaviest, not the lightest, but man, that top is just come to life. So let's go ahead, plug it in, and hear how this one sounds. With Bill Lawrence, the original pickups. whatever reason, the color of this one just reminds me of Aerosmith, so everything's just flowing out of this one. Ultimately, how do I feel about the Bill Lawrence HBR set? Sometimes I like them, sometimes not. Personally, I still prefer the Tim Shaws, but they have their own unique sound. They've got a rather percussiveness to them. I'd say the bridge has a nice growl without being too bright and attacking. It's got a real openness to it, you could say. But there we go, a look at a 1990 Les Paul reissue in the prehistoric era. I'm glad I could document it. Personally, I still prefer like the 83s and 84s a little bit over this, but if you want something a little bit modern to get some of the 90s flair, that's what these late 80s ones and early 90s have going for them, because they start to make some small, minute changes before they get to the actual historic division opening. Because I will say, I think I prefer the looks of these as far as like their more modernized finishes, because they have some really cool techniques and some great wood in this era. But you can save yourself a lot of money by just going for a plus top classic, and you get very close to this. And in some features, as we learned today, maybe even better. So what's the fate of the frets? Yeah, I really think somebody leveled them, but then forgot to recrown, because they're just so scratchy. The guitar's fighting you a little bit. That said, you can still play it just fine, but I bet the intonation would get a little bit better once you have your crowns back. So if you're interested in being the next owner of this one, feel free to reach out. Just know that you'd probably have to do a little bit of fret work. Otherwise, it just had some light wear and tear as we saw today. Although, at the same time, I might just do that work myself and keep this one, because I got a pretty fair price, so I'm not going to complain too much about having to do a bit of fret work. Well, alright, Troglodytes, I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll catch you tomorrow on the next one. Take care.